Hello, everyone. It's time to get started again. The first person this afternoon is a buddy of mine. She works at in the archives, Shirley Sorensen. And what she's been able to do is to pull together the history of black people in Will County. And so the purpose of this, or part of the purpose, is to understand the context in which Deerfield was founded. What were other black people doing in this town, and how did the newspapers report about them? So we'll get that image. Shirley?
Excuse me.
Okay, my name is Shirley Simpson, and I just got kind of interested in this by accident. I was actually doing research and found some things about the Chinese, and so I started going through the Greeley Tribune and looking elsewhere, and then I got interested in the African Americans that were living in Will County. So I thought I would talk a little bit about that. And it really is much more complex, confusing, and diverse than I ever thought it would be. And it extends far beyond Frederick Jackson Turner's thesis of the historic single white male, and whether male or female, single or married, literate or illiterate, honest or dishonest, respected or not, they help form and defend the past, present, and future history of the American West and the United States. This is a little table of the black population in Will County and Greeley, and as you can see, early on there really wasn't a real large population, but you can tell about the time that Deerfield was established and founded that the population went up. One of the first things I found was an article about a colored couple that was living here in 1874. And they referred to them as the sable gentry. And they were quite noisy and got into arguments and things, shipped them out the window. And the neighbors around there let the couple know that was unacceptable. And the next day, that couple left. And then in 1875, there was a report in the Greeley Tribune about an Indian, and I don't think it specified which tribe, was interested in purchasing an African-American woman living in the Tennessee colony, which was near in the Masters area. And I'm fascinated by this Cooney Travis. I've seen his name spelled different ways, both his first and his last name. He was reportedly the son of a Shawnee chief. His father was born in Indian Territory and his mother in Kentucky. He was a mountain man, a scout, a cowboy. He rode the Pony Express from Julesburg to California. He drove a freight wagon from Omaha. He was a U.S. Marshal. I've read that he was in the Army, a scout. He also knew Buffalo Bill Cody. His family ran errands for the Cody family when they lived in Missouri. And this is a photograph of Cooney Travis's prison record. That was with his prison record. In 1883, he was involved in a barroom brawl in Evans, and he was sentenced to 3 years in the state penitentiary for involuntary manslaughter. 2 years later, he was pardoned by Governor Benjamin Eaton after new information come to light that he had acted in self-defense. And this is his information on his prison record. He wasn't really all that tall, only 5 feet 3 3/4 inches. This is mulatto, a herder. He was born in Kansas, although it also says Indian Territory I've seen elsewhere. His mother's name, she was from Leavenworth. He was single, he didn't read or write, and then it gave a description of his scars. In the 1885 census, he boarded at a hotel on 7th Avenue, which would be in East Greeley, which is where a lot of the immigrants settled. And there were two other black boarders there. John Kraft, 32, was born in Texas, and a Joe Williams, 21, who was born in Indian Territory, and all three of these men were horse trainers. And in the 1900 census, it says he was out in the Crow Creek area, lived with Charles Simmons on the farm labor. And here he is. The talks that in 1898 he went to Cheyenne to visit with Buffalo Bill Cody. And in July 1911, he celebrated his 76th birthday at the home of Jesse S. Gale, who was a stockman. And the home is still in existence. It's at 1104 6th Street. In 1912, he started suffering hallucinations, and eventually he was admitted to work sanitarium in Pueblo, and that eventually became the Colorado State Mental Health Facility. Here's a picture of the Brown family around the 1880s. Mrs. William Brown, and her name is variously listed as Ella or Elvira in the censuses, and she had 4 children. Mrs. Brown was originally listed, I found her in the 1877 and 1878 Colorado business directories, and her occupation is listed as a laundress, but it didn't give an address. She was born in Mississippi, and her children were born in New Mexico. And you will notice that Willie, at the age of 11, was already working as a waiter. I thought that was interesting. And she was a laundress. In the 1885 census, William, who was 16, was a herder, and Ernest, who was 13, was a servant to Thomas Porter. There was also another African-American family here at the same time, the Davis family, Charity. I've also seen what it looks like it's listed as Charlie, but that could be a misspelling. She was also in the laundry business, and she was born in Tennessee, and her 3 children here were born in Kansas. What I think is interesting is that Charity Brown sent a money order to Charity Davis sent one to Ella Brown in Sterling, and so I'm wondering if Ella Brown moved to Sterling. I'm wondering what their relationship was, if they were actually related, if they were business partners or just friends. I also found a reference where Aunt Charity Davis died, and that her daughter took her body back to Leavenworth. And I'm wondering, it says she left 4 children, who her 4th child was. Could that have been Ella Brown? So that's something I need to do some more research on. Both the Brown and the Davis families are listed in the Greeley School censuses. And in 1893, the Brown family was living at 518 10th Street, which would also be on in East Greeley. And I found this interesting advertisement in the April 5th, 1894 Greeley Tribune about a young colored girl who was looking for housework. And she said to inquire at Mrs. E. Brown. I'm kind of assuming that that's Ella Brown, but I'm not sure. In 1910, there was a proposed business tax on laundries in Greeley, and this would have affected the white female laundresses, and both the Chinese and the black laundries that were on the east side of town. There was this photograph of Ed Featherston, who was a newsboy here in Greeley, who was, he was actually selling the Rocky Mountain News, and that's where this photograph appeared. Marriages, there were 2 marriages between 1864 and 1899, and then 3 between 1900 and 1915. This Peter Samuels that's listed here that applied for a marriage license to America Gray. In the 1880 federal census, he was listed as a servant to Dr. Jesse Hawes, a physician here. And Samuels was born in New York, and his parents in Massachusetts. And in the 1900 census, he's listed as a cook up in Teller County. This Mrs. Alice Brown and Neil Carlisle were married in 1911. And in the 1910 census, it's listed as it's a second marriage. So I'm wondering if when they married in 1911, if that was their second marriage or if that was their 3rd There were other blacks in Greeley. There were Negro waiters at the Oasis Hotel, but then they were replaced by white girls in 1895. There was Albert Gray. He was a janitor at the First National Bank, and I'm assuming also at the Greeley Public Library, because it was located in the bank for a while. In the fall of 1898, then, he returned to South Carolina to visit his family and friends. In 1902, the sugar factory, the Great Western Sugar Factory, brought in 150 colored men to work to lay the railroad tracks, and they also brought them in 1910 to work on the Denver, Laramie, and Northwestern Road, and they camped them out at Island Grove Park, and they were expecting more of them. Also, there was a notice in 1918 about the possibility of hundreds of Negroes replacing the rapidly disappearing Mexican labor in the beet fields in the Weld and Larimer County, and O.T. Jackson was supposed to have been involved in this. There were lots of housing problems. In 1901, there were a couple African-American men who were unable to find housing here. In 1935, there was a call at the university. There were 3 new women's dormitories being built, and one of them was supposed to be reserved for Negro women, and because the residents living in the area opposed that did not occur. And then in 1937, there was an state adult education conference at UNC, and there was a protest about 4 of the 4 Negro women students that were having to eat their meals in their rooms rather than in the dining halls with the rest of the people. And there was Bill and Albert Gaines. They had a homestead out in Coleman, which is about 12 miles south of Grover, and this was in 1909. And Wilbur B. Ball, knew the Gaines in the 1930s, and he wrote a little small booklet about their lives. He talks about the difficulties they had to overcome and how it took a while for both the Gaines and the white people that lived out there to gain each other's trust, and so eventually they helped each other out. I thought it was important to also talk about blacks in higher education. Laura Buchanan was 20 years old when she applied for admission to UNC. Her transcript shows she did not actually take any classes. She died the next year. Her sister Lucille graduated in 1905. And so she was likely the first African American that graduated from UNC. She lived with the E.M. Nussbaum family, who was a brick contractor, and he was the father of Jesse Nussbaum, who graduated from UNC in 1907, then later became superintendent of Mesa Verde National Park. Here's a photograph of the 1905 senior class, and we think Lucille, we think we know who she is, but we're not absolutely sure because we don't have anything that says who all the students were. Mary Pointler was here from 1909 to 1911. All I know about her is that she came from Georgetown, and that the Greeley Tribune said she was the first Negress that graduated from UNC. And it also said she was planning on going to the South to work among the people down there. There was some interest in promoting racial and ethnic understanding at the university. Already in 1896, a student was writing about the race problem, but it was only about what was going on in the South. And in fact, that's what most of the articles are. If people spoke to various clubs or whatever, that's what they were speaking about. There was a movement to establish a cosmopolitan club at the college, at the university. The first one was in 1921 and was in existence for about 6 months. And then it was again from about the fall of 27 to 1940 or 41. There was another cosmopolitan club in town that was an international businessman's club, but Negroes were not allowed to join that one. And they were interested in the Cosmopolitan Club in uniting the students of any race, creed, belief, nationality, and they were interested in world peace and friendship. Nemesi Aganad, I'm not sure if I'm spelling his name right, was a Filipino, and he was a staunch supporter of the Court of Fratres, the 1921 club, and he had his own problems with race and discrimination because considered him a Chink or Jap or Hawaiian or Mexican, depending on where he was traveling. And he did comment in the paper there about how un-American and unfair the attitude was toward the Philippines, and that they were not given a fair and square deal. Isabel Jenkins was a member of the Court of Fratres. She joined the Girls Friendly Society and the Home Ec Club. She lived at 1700 10th Avenue, which was the home of President John Grant Crabb. And I have found that Crabb had two other African-American servants. One was William Beeman, who, according to the article, was from Masters. During World War I, he passed his physical exam and they took him into the Army. And then in 1920, there's a Dobin Mosley that was listed. I did find some Mosleys in Boulder County, and I'm not sure if he's related to them. I'm not even sure if it should be Morley. It's kind of hard, and almost the D almost looked like an L when I was looking at the census record. And then beginning in the 1920s, you have the African American students are starting to speak out about the race issue. And in one case, they brought Miss Dorothy Gwynn from the YWCA secretary for the Phyllis Wheatley branch in Denver to speak. Their motto for the Cosmopolitan Club was "Above all nations is humanity." And here they're accepting students of different nations, races, colors, creed. William F. Butler was the first president, and as far as I know, he was the only male to head a student organization from 1920 to 45. And there were about 435 students who joined the club. Here's a photograph from a scan from the 1928 Castle Cooler yearbook showing the first group. This is William Butler right here, and his wife is right down in the corner. And there were, through the years, there were African Americans, Filipinos, Chinese, there were Japanese surnames, Iraqis, Persians, Germans, so forth. William Alexander was an interesting person. For about 6 months, he was allowed to write an article in the Mirror about a student's view of the world. And he was not a member of the Cosmopolitan Club, but his sister Livia was. And his mother lived in Greeley for over 60 years. The Associated Students in 1929 approved a petition for a joint Negro sorority between UNC and the Denver University. The Alpha Kappa Alpha House was located at 621 13th Street, which is also on the east side of Greeley. Other racial ethnic groups were, of course, the Chinese that were here from 1874 to about 39. And this means that the African American laundries would have had to compete with the Chinese as well as any white laundries. There were the German Russian families who came in 1901 and 1902 to work in the beet field. The Japanese who started arriving in 1904. And then there were also, starting in about 1910, Latinos were starting to come in. I thought this was interesting that 1910, Waring's cigar store was advertising the finest Mexican chili and tamales. Why would you be advertising that if people didn't already know what it was? And then the anti-Germanism around World War I, as well as immigration restrictions, forced farmers to start looking for large numbers of people to work in their fields. And they chose the Latinos from the southwestern United States and Mexico. And then in the 1920s, the Great Western Sugar Company started establishing colonies throughout Weld County for their Latino workers. And they faced, the Latinos were like the African Americans or the Chinese or other groups that they did face discrimination throughout their lives. They resented the signs that were placed in the windows that said that they couldn't that they weren't allowed to be served. And the Ku Klux Klan especially was known for doing that, and as well as planting crosses on property that they burned. Some of the business people did not really want to place signs in their windows, but they feared also losing the business of their white customers. One of the theater owners segregated the Mexicans, and he was on the basis of that they were offending the odor of the Mexicans. And in general, with Anglo farmers, their workers ate with them, but in the case of the Mexicans, they wouldn't allow that because they thought they were unclean. Here is one Deerfield student I've been able to find who attended UNC. I haven't seen anything so far that said they came directly from Deerfield. Her family lived in Deerfield, and then they chose to return to Denver so their children could get a high school education. And so this is Esther Hicks. Her major field of study was commercial education. She was a member of Alpha Kappa Alpha and the Cosmopolitan Club. Deerfield in general received very positive articles in the paper, and I think it's because, in a way, it was because agriculture was the lifeblood of this area. There were, they talked about the progression in the colony, any gains in land values, celebrations, fairs, and activities, roads, crops, and other topics. And occasionally there would be something about some kind of a criminal activity that occurred out there. But in general, things were very positive. And I just did a couple things here about the positive news that was on there. And the November 1921 issue of the Weld County News had an article about the Weld County's Negro colony, and it was very positive. It was very, to me, it's still inspiring reading it today. And it's because they did, I mean, for them, their dream did come true for a while at least. And that's the end of my presentation.
Shirley, thank you very much for that wonderful presentation. So if you want to know anything about different groups, and really, that's the woman to go to. Now, Dr. Rob Reinsvold has been working at Deerfield for a few years, doing soil samples, tree cores, and everything like that. He studied the rainfall, all of that. So now, Dr. Rob Reinsvold.
Well, thank you. Like many of you, before I got involved, George was one of the instigators and all that. He came over one day over to, I teach over here at Greeley in UNC, and we had been on other committees, and he came over one day and he said, I want to get some money from the provost to do some summer research, and who around here in the biology department knows anything about soils? And I was his only contact in biology at that time. I also happened to have had a background somewhat in soil ecology, soil microbiology, so I said, well, you know, we got talking more about it, and I said that'd be a great way for me to get involved in it too. But before that, I had not really heard much about Deerfield too, and I think that was about 10, 15 years ago that we did that first one. And so from there, it's kind of ballooned, and we've done other things. One of our first questions that first summer was looking at from standpoint, we had 4 of us. We had a historian, an economics person, a political science, and I was kind of the expert from the ecology or agricultural standpoint. And try to take the question is, well, what led to their demise? What was it about it? And my particular one was it because the people that moved from the cities, so many of them that moved out there were from the cities, Did they just not know how to farm the land and all that? Or were there other factors that actually play a role? So that's somewhat of what I'm going to be touching on. Primarily touching on the soils, water, weather, somewhat in the farming practices. You've heard a lot about the economics, politics, and just the kind of the fate type things. But Deerfield, you've seen plenty of pictures that we have on there, and I stole this picture from Kevin Lyles earlier on some of the homesteads that we have out there. Again, the area that the town site is just that small little area up in the top up there. That's where the town site is. All the rest of them are potentially then homesteads that could have been part of the community that would have been filed in that area. You also notice that this is a whole square mile, so most of the homesteads would have been a half of a 320 acres or so, some of them 160 acres. All that. These were the successful filings. This was actually taken from Karen Waddell's work originally, as far as the screening on that. So if we look at that, and we look at that same area there, this is again taken from Kevin originally. He didn't show it because he let me take it from it. If we look at the soils that are in that area, this is the Empire Reservoir right up in here. You can see that there is the Empire Intake Canal. It actually goes right through the town site there. It would have been kind of disturbing to have this water flow right past you and you didn't have any access to it. And then we have the no, this is the bayou. Is that the bayou? Yeah, that's the bayou. That one up there is the Empire Intake one. The two irrigation canals that are coming in, going past the town site, but also being. But most of the soils in here, the soils that we have, what I'm going to roll out is all the white soil there, which is the vast majority of it. 78% is that valent sand. The valent sand with the little lower slopes is another 6%. So vast majority of this is a sandy valent sand type soil. The Osco sands is another one in there. Add all those up. Vast majority of this is a very deep sandy soil. And I'll give you a little bit of profile of what some of those are. The valent sand and the Osco sand that we have right now is deep sandy soils, primarily formed by wind deposits. They have very high permeability of the water. Water flows through it, flows out of it. So there's not a lot of water storage in there. And they are susceptible to erosion, but wind erosion as well as water erosion, all that. And this is just kind of technical as far as where they actually come from. But as soils go, they're marginal in that sense. I'll make it. Now back here, there was a few little areas here that are the Bona sandy loams. Those little areas are way up near some of the Platte River up there. So just a few areas that were a little bit more loamy and all that. This is that loamy sand, bit more deposits there that are both wind deposit as well as the alluvial or river deposits. So we have some of that we have in there. Again, not really the most productive soils, but not bad, not bad. And the valent sand we'll find is not terrible soil, but it's still listed somewhat on the low scale as far as we have. As far as if we look at it now, it would be considered in our classes on this is with irrigations, there still be some limitations. Without irrigation, probably even more. This is just taken directly out of soil survey data as far as the classification. One of the biggest risks in this area for this type of soil would be erosion as well, but just not having water is the main thing that we have. Now, when I went out there and we did some soil testing and actually looked at the nutrient levels, if you can see on this, nutrient levels, the ones with one asterisk here are low. The ones that are high are some of our minor nutrients. They're not too bad. But for the most part, we have soils that are in the low range. The recommendations today would be that they would have had to augment with fertilizer, manure, and there's some evidence that they probably did that in many of the areas as well. Here's the farmland classification of that same zone that we have in here. And I'll show you a couple of these slides just looking at different things. but the green area in here are statewide significance. Those are probably the better lands. As the classification goes, it's kind of in the medium range. It's kind of a moderate range. But this red zone, which is a lot of it here, that's the area that would be, by today's standards, is considered not prime land. Okay. Did O.T. Jackson have access to all the soils data at that time? Probably not. Okay. He was looking at the site and thought a really good site based upon the proximity to the railroads up there, to the Platte. It wasn't that bad of a site compared to what he could have had. And remember, this is also in 1910 when a lot of these homesteads were already established. So a lot of the good places. Over here, we have Lost Creek coming down through here. All those plots out there were probably already taken. Any place that had access to water, they were already pretty well taken up by the time 1910 came around. So they were picking out soils or plots that were kind of marginal in that sense to start off with. So they have that. Now, the availability of water is probably what we see throughout the Eastern Plains is really what's limiting how productive these areas are. There's three ways of getting that. One is the precipitation, having good rainfall. We live in a semi-arid zone. This is considered a semi-arid zone, and average rainfall is about 12 inches a year. Okay, so that's not the diversion from surface waters. Those are the ditches that are going by. That was done throughout this area, but again, getting access to that is that Colorado water law is the first in, what is it? I got to have that later. First in time, first in line, or so, as far as the priority rights. Now, they could also be pumping of groundwater. Kevin showed you where there were some of the wells that had up there, and they also had some of those pivot irrigations that you can do for irrigation of getting some of that up. With the sprinkler systems, those big circular rounds that we saw in some of the aerial photos. Not much evidence that they used the big pivot irrigations. There's none of that they had there. And then also they didn't have access to that. So they didn't have the water. So let's look at just the precipitation that we have. This would be typical for the site that we have. I'm actually using data here from UNC, so it'd be it's Greeley, but we're not that far away. So it's probably comparable. It may be a little bit drier. But these are averages, and then in every 10 years, kind of the extremes that you might expect that you'd actually see along there. Here is what we'd see over the years. And I know it's small down here. This is 1900 here, 1910 when it started. Notice the first 2 years, kind of low. You've heard a little bit about the harsh first couple years. They were harsh as far as precipitation as well. Then they had several fairly relatively good years. And then it kind of went up and down. And then in the 30s down here, we had several years down here. Now, to give you a reference bar, the 12, the average goes right across here. To make it profitable by our current standards, you would need to add another 12 inches to make it profitable. So if we look at that, the number of times that it was really up here is not too many. So again, without water, they would have been struggling no matter what. With water, it's going to be a challenge because the soils are still. So they still needed to have the water. Need to have those additional. We have 12 inches per year on average. Need another approximately 12 more inches to make it profitable. During the good years, there was a few good years there. In the good years, if I go back real quick here, some of these good years here, they coincided with when the price of wheat was really fairly high too. So they had some good years, also when it probably would have been very profitable to get it out on that. But then we have 1 year that we don't have any data that wasn't collected for that year. Okay. Now, if we look on today's standards on the same thing, if I was able to irrigate that land, this would be the bushels per acre of that I could get out of that. That's not real high by our current standards, but if we compared that with what Karen gave us, even on some of the good years, that the one that she quoted, I need to look at all the other ones. She was quoting that, and I can't remember the name of the gentleman that had on it, but he got 15 to 20 bushels per acre that he had of corn. And so on good years, we could have it, but that's, so they're not getting a lot that they actually have. In irrigated wheat, we can get, there's some soil there that we, so the soils are not necessarily terrible, but without the water, it's going to go down quite a bit. Now, I don't have the access of what it would be like with non-irrigation because it's not even really recommended. The soil survey doesn't give it. But if I go through for rangeland, just for cattle production, which a lot of the area now is being used for that, in good years, favorable years, we would then get approximately 1,900 pounds per acre of foliage that we can have. To give you a comparison, I know it's small in here, in range management they often use an animal unit month. And an animal unit month is how much a mature cow would need to consume. It's about 800 per month per acre, okay, pounds per month. And so you can then kind of divide that up and then decide how much you're actually getting as far as how many cattle you have. So you can support a few cattle on that. That wouldn't be too bad. If we go down then to a normal year, that drops down. Most of the land, most of the sandy soil goes down by about half that. It was 1,900 to 1,100 there. And if we go then down to some of the unfavorable years, then it goes down to 760. Okay. At what point is it economically feasible that you're not making enough to sustain yourself? That's this is by our current standards, and what I need to do is compare this to the historical standards as far as what they actually have there. The access to the irrigation water, we had the Empire intake ditch, the bayou ditch that we're going right through the town sites. We had the Empire Reservoir, and then some well water in there. First in time, first in right is prevented most of them from being able to get access to this water. It had already been appropriated. And that's what we still find today, is to get access to water, you got to buy the water rights from somebody else. And so had they had the funds to appropriate it, they might have still been able to get it. But there's no records that they were actually able to do it. There was some records that near the one of the homesteads near the reservoir that there might have been good seepage that came out, and they might have been able to benefit from that. And if the soils around where the reservoir were those sandy soils too, that would have been, because I think that reservoir is an online reservoir, isn't it?
Online.
Yeah, it's online, so that seepage actually would have benefited those that would have been just close to and found on. Okay, so access to irrigation. Again, we have the big reservoir up here. We've got the bayou canal going through here, and then this is the Empire intake one going through here. You might have gotten that reversed before. So the farming practices. Now, another thought that we had is, were the settlers out there city folk that just didn't know how to farm, or did they not use the best practices of the day? Evidence suggests, because there was several times in which we have that they probably actually interacted with the extension agents at CSU, which was the Colorado Agricultural College at the time. So they had the best practices, and they appears to be they practiced the best practices at the time. And they were using dryland farming, and the tenets at the time that we'd have for dryland farming would have been that you need to have some way of storing that rainwater and preventing the loss of it. So they did what they needed to do, given what they had, as far as the dryland farming. Okay. The weather, though, played a role with the generally dry, the low humidity, windy, the potential for those hot summers and the cold winters. That probably then played a big role as far as the success of these. And if you look at just temperature, that should be a little a degree sign up there. But if we look at the overall temperatures here, these are averages for the months that we actually have. But here's what we could have as far as some of the extremes. And so some of the extremes are, there's times, again, it's not too atypical. We're used to this around here of having 100 degrees, but that's about the same time in which we're having the crops coming in, so that's going to be the highest stress point for the plants as well. Highest transpiration rates, highest need for additional water that we actually have as well. Okay? So the conclusions that I come up with is that there is a lot of challenges. They started off with sandy soils. They had low availability of water. The weather conditions were such that it's going to be hard on the crops anyhow. Then the productivity itself is dependent upon those. The crop profitability is also dependent upon other things such as economics. That was also going on. That's kind of beyond what I would want to go on for today. But I would contend out of all this is they still use the best practices as they had, and they, what Peggy said is that it was they're a microcosm. There was a lot of communities throughout the Eastern Plains that had similar type conditions, and it's just a lot of challenges to try to overcome. If you were trying to make it as an agricultural community, which I know they had efforts to change that focus and make it more towards tourism or other areas. But for just straight agriculture, they had the kind of cards stacked against them to start off with. Okay, so that's fun.
Thanks, Rob. Next we have from the Greeley Museum, Peggy Ford Walville. And as I tell many people, if you want to know the history of Deerfield, she probably knows it better than all of us others put together. She's been working on it for a long while. And also, she even knows the history of some of the colonies before that, like the Green City colony, which is really kind of a funny story. But anyway, welcome.
Thank you for inviting me today. I've learned a tremendous amount already. It's always great to keep adding to the knowledge that one has and learning how it fits in to the other pieces of the puzzle that other people have. So many of you have already covered some of the things that I was going to address, but I think I'll maybe summarize a few things and add a few other little things along the way. One of the things that strikes me is that, again, Deerfield was no different than many other communities of its type in Weld County during the time that it was in existence. And so I hope I can share some of that with you in terms of just some interesting patterns. There are two concepts, I think, when you look at the history of Colorado and maybe world history in general, and especially the American West, that come into play. And that those are the wet and drought or wet and dry cycles, and the boom and bust cycles. And sometimes these two cycles interconnect with each other and greatly affect what happens to people, places, and events, and especially in terms of the economy of a region as well. So, if it's wet, you're set. If it's dry, you die. Or if it's dry, you cry. If you can remember that, that's essentially, pretty much it in a nutshell. I have some information here on some of those historical wet and drought cycles here, if I can find it. Hang on just a second here. Papers here. What we get starting in the late 19th century, I kind of put it in a sheet here in red and blue for dry and wet. 1893 to 1905 was a very dry period in Colorado's history. It was a drought of about 12 years. Obviously some periods of rain throughout that time as well. But also in 1893, we have the Panic of 1893, which adds then that layer of about 6 years of depression in the 1890s to it. Obviously, we have the problem with the silver. The Panic of 1893 had to do with the silver versus the gold standard. Colorado being a silver state, we were hard hit by that. But during this period, we also end up politically with the populist movement really becoming quite strong in the state. And of course, the populist movement was one that really was sensitive and very much a part of the agrarian history of our region. So again, sensitive to the farmers. And so a lot of people begin to embrace that. And then by 1905, this is where it's really interesting, I think, 1905 to 1931, and Rob just showed you his bar graph where we get 26 years of wet period. So this is the just about the longest extended wet period in recorded history that we have. And again, when did Deerfield come into existence and when was its heyday? It was during this proverbial wet cycle. But during this same period in the county, there were some other things going on that O.T. Jackson would have been very much aware of because he was a reader. Number one, he would have been aware of the efforts by a gentleman in this area known as Daniel A. Camfield. His nickname was the Empire Builder. He was a huge entrepreneur. He had worked on major irrigation projects in the Julesburg area, big reservoir projects. He had worked on Empire Reservoir, Riverside Reservoir near what would become the site of Deerfield, various intake canals and so on. Camfield himself had come out in the 1880s and had settled in the Crow Creek area. And he began to come up with this idea and involve a number of other groups of people, starting in the opening decade of the 20th century, to divert water from the Laramie River west of Fort Collins and divert it through a tunnel, empty it into the North Fork of the Cache-la-Poudre River, and then divert it through a system of canals and reservoirs to irrigate what he hoped would become a rival irrigated district to the Greeley district. Greeley by 1900 was known as the garden spot of the state of Colorado because we had so many of those early and priority rights to water and irrigation. So Camfield then proposes this big irrigation district which he hopes would irrigate 100,000 to 125,000 acres up northeast of Greeley. So he proposes the project. You read much about it in the newspapers of that time, both the Greeley Tribune and other newspapers around the state. And in 1908, a huge a 4-part edition in the Greeley Tribune is published, and spread across the newspaper is his promotion that let no fertile land go dry. So he's going to create this huge project and begins to tell all about it. So he gets investors on board, he hires people to start building the infrastructure, the tunnel, this, that, and the other. Bonds are issued to $3.7 million, and of course then tax liens against property per acre were $37 per acre to help build this infrastructure that was literally going to transform this area. So again, it looked like things were really going well, except in 1911, the state of Wyoming and others filed a suit against D.A. Camfield and his Greeley-Poudre Irrigation Company and another company that was involved with this. And this ends up in litigation until 1922, when it's finally taken to the Supreme Court of the United States. And the Supreme Court rules that D.A. Camfield, who thought that indeed he would be able to get the majority of the water diverted from the Laramie River and for use in this project, would indeed not be given to him at all. In fact, 75.5 acre feet would go to Wyoming, and only 15.5 acre feet could be diverted annually to his project. Well, that's not even enough to wet the ditches, let alone fill the reservoirs. So in the meantime, what had happened then was people diligently started work on this project, and so there are scars across the landscape in northeastern Colorado that you can follow, showing some of these early ditch systems, McGrew Reservoir, what had been hollowed out, what was going to happen. It was such a big deal, and Camfield thought he was really on a roll, that the Union Pacific Railroad decided to create 2 branch lines to serve this new irrigated district. And so that happened in August of 1909, and the UP paid better than some Greeley individuals who had hired Greek laborers to build the our interurban system, our Greeley streetcar system. So a lot of the Greek and Italian laborers defected to work on the Union Pacific branch line. So this was the Pleasant Valley branch of the Union Pacific Railroad, which was built up to Hungerford, which was later named Purcell. And so the towns along there that you would head north out of Greeley, then you'd turn at Lucerne, and you'd hit Osgood, and then it would branch off then to Gailton, and then to Camfield, and then to Purcell. The next line went a little farther through, I'm sorry, I said Osgood, should have been Cloverly. Went through Cloverly, then Barnesville, and then we hit Cornish, Foston, and it terminated at Briggsdale. And they put on the new bullet-shaped McKean motor cars to service this line as well. So everything was in place. And based on this, of course, all these little towns that were platted, people began to move in and take up homesteading and homestead under the Enlarged Homestead Act, which you've heard about, the Desert Land Act and other things, and all was to be well. Well, what happened is when a suit is filed by the state of Wyoming against Colorado and D.A. Camfield, it becomes very hard then to find money to issue bonds. D.A. Camfield goes back to New York City. He's 54 years old in the fall of 1914 to try to secure additional financing, and he drops dead on the street of a heart attack. Although some people say, no, I think he really committed suicide, but you can imagine the stress he is under at this time. So in essence, you know, hundreds of people lose what they had invested, and pretty much the land remains the land of dryland farming today, although of course we have the option of pumping and center pivot irrigation in parts of it and so on. They tried to reinvigorate this system after the court case was settled in 1923, and of course this happened at a big ceremony in the town of Nunn, Colorado. Some of you might have seen the water tower there, which says, "Watch none grow," and that was the little catchphrase is, just you wait, times are going to get better, watch none grow. Other things happened too. World War I, of course, high prices were paid for crops especially because soldiers needed to be fed in the war effort. So O.T. Jackson, at the time that Deerfield was really in its heyday, farmers were receiving extraordinarily high prices for the crops that were raised. And of course, in the post-World War I era, the prices really began to drop. The bottom falls out of the wheat market, for example, and other prices on different kinds of crops are much lower. This is when we begin to legislate for federal subsidies and price controls on agricultural products and that sort of thing as well. So again, these wet and drought boom and bust cycles. I have a big map over there. I don't know if you could see it, but I kind of drew on it some of the outline of the Camfield project. I might have you guys come up, and Shirley and Martha, why don't you come up and just bring it? I'll see if I can show you some things there on that, just so you get a bit of a sense of it. When times are good, of course, 1890, the population of Weld County was 11,736. Weld County's population has eroded area size has eroded quite a bit. We were one of 17 original counties in the state, originally over 10,500 square miles. But for this period, we were a little over 4,000 square miles in area, the third largest county in the state. So 11,736 people in 1890. By 1900, about 17,000 in the county. 1910, 39,177. So again, look at this population coming up and immigration into the state and what have you. By 1920, 54,059. 1930, 65,000. 1940, 64,941. So again, we go into that period from 1931 to 1941, pretty much a period of drought. The Dust Bowl, the Dirty 30s, depression overlaid on top of that. A couple of years in the mid-30s where there's a little bit more rain, but primarily drought. And so we end up with Deerfield kind of between a rock and a hard place in terms of outliving and outlasting these forces of nature that are somehow against it. Even the resources that were being developed in terms of the early oil and oil industry in Weld County with the Wattenberg Field and the Greasewood Flats area, that peaked for just a few years. Development started in the late 1920s, early 1930s. By 1937, 38, pretty much all the wells have been pumped out, and we wait for new technology and deeper drilling and fracking and horizontal drilling techniques to come much later. So again, there was hope that perhaps there would be some reinvigoration of Deerfield in the late 1930s through the oil industry. That was not to happen, but it might happen in the 21st century, who knows. Let me show you a couple things here, if you can see. So this was the diversion area here. This was all the land in the county that was to be watered by the Greeley-Cooter Irrigation District, D.A. Camfield's project. Down here is Empire and Riverside reservoirs, the Bijou Ditch, the Empire Inlet. So Deerfield isn't even on this map. This is 1908. And then all of these other little towns that were platted in Weld County between 1887 and 1889 along the Burlington and Missouri Railroad, later becoming the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy line. Many of these towns then had a brief boom period, and then they went bust by 1890, 1891, when we get the Panic of 1893 and then the drought and depression. They all boom again, just like Deerfield did after 1909. Post offices are established and so on. But places like Kyoto, Colorado, by the 1940 census, a little town that by 1920 had close to maybe 200 people.
has 34 people living there. So the same thing that was happening at Deerfield happened to all these other places. I don't know if you can see it, some of you probably can't see over here, but these are the two little branch lines in purple of the railroad. And again, these little towns, except for really Gailton and Briggsdale, Barnesville, there's very little there, Cloverly, nothing, Osgood, Cornish and Boston, nothing. Canfield has been remained platted and there are residences there now. Purcell, just kind of a ghost town as well. So I'll leave that back there if anybody wants to take a look at it. You can kind of just get a sense that, again, everything that was important to Deerfield was important to the boom of all this other stuff. Hopes of some type of irrigation, the highway system, the good roads movement, the railroads, and all of that. Thanks, you guys can sit down. I'll finish up here with just a couple of things. Shirley kind of covered that succession of immigrants. We needed immigrants because raising of sugar beets, which was a critical crop, very, very important. You needed just to have a lot of people. Just required a lot of stoop labor. I don't have time to go into all of that, but we were always a county of immigrants. Even today, we have many immigrants, many different peoples here in our city, the city of Greeley alone. We have 38 languages that are spoken in the Greeley school district. One other thing I just want to mention, O.T. Jackson, I think, was a very charismatic man, and he was a very well-educated man in terms of just reading the local papers and keeping on top of the pulse of things. And that's what I like about him. He was a huge booster. He could get people on board. He could get people to try things. Rob, you did mention about the county agents, and there is an article about the county agent visiting the colony. Professor Knapp from the State Agricultural College came and talked to the settlers in 1917 about fertilizing the crops and crop rotation and all of these things. And so people were wanting to do the right things and to make the colony a great success. Even after the 1930s, when there were just a handful of people in Deerfield, and World War II broke out, O.T. Jackson wrote to the governor of Colorado and asked if perhaps Deerfield could become an internment camp for the Japanese that Governor Carr had invited here. He put ads in the Greeley Tribune to sell Deerfield as well. As an aside, his last will was made in Greeley in 1947, and as I was looking through some of the documents that we had and photocopies of things, I discovered that his attorney was Ralph Waldo, who was my husband's grandfather, and of course he said my trusted friend, and you know, Ralph Waldo is handling my last, you know, will and affairs and what have you. Well, Ralph Waldo was one of these people who was lured out to Weld County from Boulder, and O.T. Jackson had spent some time in Boulder as well, running businesses, to Purcell by D.A. Camfield's project, in which he was hopeful that, you know, there would soon be water. And of course there was no water. The Depression hit. He went back to Boulder, opened a store, and then came back to Greeley during the 1940s and opened his law practice. And so both Ralph Waldo and O.T. Jackson would have had many similar experiences just during that particular era in our history. So it's a fascinating story, and a story that is just such a microcosm of just the bigger picture, not only of Weld County and Greeley, but of the state of Colorado, and certainly the American West. O.T. Jackson died here in Greeley at the Well County Hospital. And there were 2 hospitals in Greeley, both owned by the county. One was known as the Greeley Hospital, 16th Street and 11th Avenue. That was the Pay branch. But if he died at what they called the Will County Hospital, that would have been the known as the Will County Nursing Home, and where some of the indigent people would be cared for. And that was at Island Grove Park. And so he died in the hospital there on February 18th, 1948. So in closing, it was kind of prophetic that the conference would be today. And so we all pay honor and tribute to O.T. Jackson, who through documents and camaraderie and research has allowed all of us into not only his life and the life of Deerfield, but into our own history and the wonderful sense of joy we get through exploration and research. So thank you all.
Kind of asking back of Rob and Peggy. I don't know what the panic is. I'm guilty. And so can she tell me what the panic of 18, what did you say, the panic of 18-something?
1893.
Was that?
That had to do with the issuing of silver coinage versus the silver versus the gold standard. So that's what that was about. So, and of course we were a silver state, all the silver mining and everything. So it was, they were going to seek to limit the amount of currency that would be printed based on silver. So anyway.
And then the second question has to do with in the DVD, the Deerfield DVD by Donnie Beck. There's a piece in there, and I forget who they're interviewing. It's an older black woman who said her mother went to. It had to do with the water rights, and she said something about her mother going down to Denver and getting papers. Do you have any information on that?
No, I remember seeing that last night, but yeah, there was some big battle, and she just went to the courts and got her way.
Yeah.
She stood up for it and stuff. Yeah.
And I don't know if that was just that little strip of land and the water that was coming through.
Yeah, there was. It was that seepage, and people tried to divert the water from the seepage, and she wasn't going to stand for that.
Yeah.
She apparently was able to file for the water rights for that lake that was created. But they remember she was also saying in the movie that they was it you? You and Charlie, yeah, went there and had a picnic in the same spot.
So that was that secondary lake, or that extra.
Right.
Okay.
Yes, well, in Colorado water law, the first rule is first in time, first in right. So the first person in time to put the water to beneficial use has the right to use it. But the second part of Colorado water law, and essentially the water law in the other 19 semi-arid western states, is that you must provide for the latecomers. So there are not only the senior water rights, but there are the junior water rights to both ditches and reservoirs. So, in time of drought, in a priority system, those who have the most senior right have the right to use that water. So this woman may well have gotten a number attached to her right to use, that water. And it might have been adjudicated in the water court in Denver.
Thank you. Right now, we're going to take a short break, and so we'll be back in just a few minutes. We're supposed to get back together about quarter after, just 3 or 4 minutes, but let's take maybe by 20 after if we can come back and get started again.
Mm-hmm.